Namaste, good morning, and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Om Sarva Jiva Papanashakaranam Bhaveshwaram Swikritam cha garbhavasa deha pashamidrisham Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Tannamami deva deva Ramakrishna Mishwaram Om Shri Vivekanandari Satchishya Supujitaya Shri Sharada Devya Virata Sevitaya Shri Ramakrishna Paramahamsaya Avatara Varishtaya Chate Namaha. We salute Sri Ramakrishna, God of gods and Lord of existence, who of his own free will took on human birth and lived a luminous life of divine play for the destruction of human ills. We salute that incarnation of God, Paramahamsa Ramakrishna, who was worshipped by pure-hearted disciples like Vivekananda, and who was ceaselessly served by Sri Sharada Devi, the Divine Mother herself. Om Tava Katamritam Tapta Jivanam Kavibhiriditam Kalmashapaham Shravana Mangalam Shrimadatam Bhuvi Grinanti Ye Bhuridha Jana. O Lord, your nectar-like words are praised by the wise and full of auspiciousness. They destroy the curse of evil, bring good to those who hear them, and bring new life to those who are scorched by the ills of worldly existence. Magnanimous indeed are they who spread your message. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Om, peace, peace, peace be unto us all. So this morning we will continue in our study of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna where we left off. And so we are at the beginning of Saturday, September 22nd, 1883. And that's near the bottom of page 288. So Sri Ramakrishna was seated in the drawing room of Adhmar's house in Kolkata with Rakal, Adhmar, M. Ishan, and other devotees. Many gentlemen of the neighborhood were also present. It was afternoon. So of course, when Sri Ramakrishna would go to Calcutta, whoever was his host would invite neighbors and friends and acquaintances and other devotees of Sri Ramakrishna in Calcutta. And so that, of course, had happened at Adhar's house, who was a very well-known devotee. We've encountered him already a number of times in the Gospel. He's one of the frequent people mentioned in the Gospel. The master was very fond of Ishan. He had been a superintendent in the accountant general's office, and later on his children also occupied high government positions. One of his children, was a classmate of Narendra. Ishan's purse was always open for the poor and needy. When he retired from service, he devoted his time to spiritual practices and charity. He often visited Sri Ramakrishna at Dakshineshwar. And so Sri Ramakrishna, as it says, Sri Ramakrishna was very fond of Ishan. because Ishan was doing that which one should do. That is, in his retirement, he was using his time in charity and in spiritual practice. And he was a person who was naturally generous. He didn't turn away the needy or the poor, those who needed his help. And so naturally, Sri Ramakrishna had a great love for him, for his spiritual inclinations as well as his generosity of spirit. So, Master to Ishan, please tell us the story of the boy who posted the letter. So as we'll see, Sri Ramakrishna had heard all of these stories before, so he knew exactly what to ask Ishan to tell. So he asks him to tell one story after the other. So he asks him to tell the story of the boy who posted the letter. Ishan, with a smile, a boy once heard that God is our creator. So he wrote a letter to God, setting forth his prayers, and posted it. The address he put on the envelope was heaven. Master, with a smile, did you hear that story? One succeeds in spiritual life when one develops a faith like that boy's. So here that, of course, Sri Ramakrishna would often say such things, as did Jesus. Jesus said the same in the Christian Bible, that you must become as one of these, one of the children that were gathered around him, that the kingdom of heaven is for such as these, those who have the simplicity and innocence of a child. And as Sri Ramakrishna would say in various places in the gospel, Paramahamsas, that is, souls of a very high order, they keep children around them in order to foster within themselves the innocence and natural detachment of a child, where one moment a child's whole life is in a toy that it has, and the next moment it sets the toy aside and doesn't care for it and goes on to something else. Its attachments are not lasting. They're only for fun. And again, the faith like the boys who wrote the letter to God and addressed it to heaven. Like, of course, in this country, at Christmas time, children write letters to Santa and post it to the North Pole. And so there's special places where you can post letters to, so children can post letters to Santa addressed to the North Pole also. So, and that, of course, is pertinent to our present study of the Katha Upanishad, where the boy Nachiketa had the faith of a boy, that childlike faith and simplicity. So then the master says to Ishan again, tell us about the renunciation of activities. So another story. So Ishan, after the attainment of God, religious duties such as the sandhya drop away. So let me stop from time to time to explain particular words, because otherwise I go all the way through, and those not familiar with these Hindu terms want to know what we're talking about. So after the attainment of God, religious duties such as the sandhya drop away. Sandhya refers to a meeting of two things. And so the Sandhya ceremony is a ceremony done by the religious Hindus at the time of sunset and the time of dawn, the meeting of day and night, the two meetings of day and night in the 24 hours. And so there one goes through certain purificatory prayers and rituals, and then one recites the Gayatri Mantra, etc. So it's not a long ceremony, a short ceremony, but one that requires some purification, self-purification, then mental purification, and then the prayer of the sacred Gayatri Mantra. So after the attainment of God, religious duties such as the sandhya drop away, Ishan says. One day, some people were sitting on the bank of the Ganges performing the sandhya, but one of them abstained from it. On being asked the reason, he said, I am observing ashocha. Ashocha means impurity, literally, or the observance of impurity. And so for an Orthodox Hindu, there are two main periods of impurity. One is on the birth of a child in the family, in the blood, a blood relation, the birth of a child, and then the death of a blood relation. Those two are considered moments of, or periods of ashocha, periods of impurity, when one is not allowed to perform the sandhya rites and other rituals like daily puja and so forth. So he's asked why he's not performing the sandhya. He says, I am observing ashocha. I cannot perform the sandhya ceremony. In my case, the defilement is due to both a birth and a death. My mother, ignorance, is dead, and my son, self-knowledge, has been born. So he can't perform his sandhya because his mother, ignorance, is dead. Why is ignorance his mother? Because it's ignorance that gives birth to all of this. It's our ignorance which lands us here. We are here because of ignorance. And so figuratively, ignorance is our mother. It's that which causes our presence, brings us into these circumstances. And then self-knowledge is his son, because self-knowledge has dawned, has taken birth. So ignorance produced him, and then through spiritual practice and the grace of God, self-knowledge arises. And so that's like the birth of a son. So for both reasons, he can't perform his sandhya. So the meaning, of course, is actually what Ishan had said in the beginning, that after the attainment of God, religious duties such as the sandhya drop away. So this man's sandhya and other religious duties had dropped away because of the attainment of self-knowledge. But the man puts it in this poetic way, that it's because of my ashocha, the birth, the death of my mother and the birth of a son. Master, tell us also how caste distinctions drop away when one attains self-knowledge. Ishan, Shankaracharya was once climbing the steps after finishing his bath in the Ganges, when he saw just in front of him an untouchable who had a pack of dogs with him. You have touched me, said Shankara. Revered sir, said the pariah, I have not touched you, nor have you touched me. The self is the inner ruler of all beings and cannot be contaminated. Is there any difference between the sun's reflection in wine and its reflection in the Ganges? And so a beautiful incident in the life of Shankaracharya, and there's a small text which records this incident in the life of Shankaracharya when he had just taken his bath, and so he was physically pure from his bath when an untouchable was coming down the steps towards the water and brushed past him. And Shankaracharya accosted him and said, what, you have polluted me, you've touched me, meaning that now I have to go take my bath again because you've touched me. And it turns out that the untouchable was Shiva himself, who had come to give him the knowledge that the self is beyond all such distinctions of high and low, Brahmin and untouchable, etc. And so the untouchable tells Shankaracharya that how can I touch you or you touch me when the self has no form, when the self is infinite, when the self is beyond all time and space, etc. Where can there be any contact with that which is by nature contactless? And so Shankaracharya's ignorance disappeared. That's very significant because not just the incident and the fact that Shankara his blindness towards caste distinctions was eliminated by that experience, but because it shows something important in higher spiritual life. It's not something we have to worry about now, but it is true of higher spiritual life, that after one attains the knowledge of Brahman, one's behavior in this world can still follow old patterns. And in that way, old vestiges of ignorance can still remain in the personality. When one attains to the highest illumination, one attains to the highest knowledge, and one is liberated by that itself. But it's said in the tradition, and in texts like the Jivan Mukti Viveka by Vidyaranya, that we, after attaining to the highest experience, we have to attain it again and again in order to burn out all vestiges of ignorance. So we see that Shankaracharya, who was already an illumined soul, he was already writing his great commentaries when this happened, when he still had this caste discrimination within him. And we see the same in Swami Vivekananda. After his attainment of enlightenment, and then after the death of Sri Ramakrishna, Swamiji went traveling around India, and he came to Khetri in the Rajasthan. There he there was the incident where the dancing girl was singing in the court of the king of Khetri, the Raja of Khetri. Swamiji was his guest in the palace. And the Raja sent word to Swamiji to come to listen to the dancing girl because her voice was very beautiful. And Swamiji sent word back that he would not come. Because being a sannyasi, he was not going to listen to a dancing girl, because dancing girls in those days were not just looked on as prostitutes, they often were prostitutes. And so Swamiji, as a monk, he was not going to go to listen to the music. So then the young woman who was singing, she understood why Swamiji had refused the invitation, and so she sang a very plaintive song, a very famous song about, "Oh Lord, one sword of iron is in the butcher shop, chopping up meat," a very unholy activity by Hindu standards. And another is the golden sword another is the sword, not golden, but another is the sword in the hand of the deity in the temple, because some of the deities hold swords like Durga and Kali, etc. But both are turned to gold when they touch the philosopher's stone. So, O Lord, look not upon my qualities, but look at the intention of my heart. The idea being that God turns everything to gold. So look not upon my evil qualities, but upon the intention of my heart, I who am worshiping you. So Swamiji, hearing that song, he was overcome with emotion and remorse for having rejected the invitation to hear the dancing girl. And so with tears streaming down his face, he came into the hall to listen to the rest of the music, realizing his mistake. And from that point forward, you find that Swamiji's attitude towards people was quite different. In fact, later, when he was in America, he said, now I could live in the same house with prostitutes without ever a thought of reproach arising in my mind. Meaning that he had the ability to see divinity within all, without discrimination. So Shankaracharya was once climbing the steps. I read the whole thing. No, I didn't. Let me go back and read. Shankaracharya was once climbing the steps after finishing his bath in the Ganges when he saw just in front of him an untouchable who had a pack of dogs with him. "You have touched me," said Shankara. "Revered sir," said the pariah, "I have not touched you, nor have you touched me. The self is the inner ruler of all beings, the Antaryami, and cannot be contaminated. Is there any difference between the sun's reflection in wine and its reflection in the Ganges?" So again, a beautiful illustration of that point. Master with a smile, again to Ishan. And about harmony, how one can realize God through all paths, asking Ishan to tell another story. So Ishan smiling, both Hari and Hara, Hari is a name of Vishnu and Hara is a name of Shiva. Both Hari and Hara are derived from the same root. That is, in Sanskrit grammar, all words theoretically, and most of them actually, come from a verbal root. And so Hari and Hara come from the same verbal root, Hri, which means to take away. And so both Hari and Hara are derived from the same verbal root. The difference is only in pratyaya, that is, the ending that you add to the verbal root to make the word. In reality, he who is Hari is also Hara. That is, he who is Vishnu is also Shiva. If a man has faith in God, then it doesn't matter whom he worships. Master. And please tell us also about how the heart of the sadhu is the greatest of all. So Ishan. This earth is the largest thing we see anywhere around us. But larger than the earth is the ocean. And larger than the ocean is the sky. But Vishnu, the Godhead, has covered earth, sky, and the netherworld with one of his feet. And that foot of Vishnu is enshrined in the sadhu's heart. Therefore, the heart of a holy man is the greatest of all. So that Vishnu, as a Vamana Avatara, he tread over the earth, the sky, and the heavenly worlds. So that's the idea here, that the foot of Vishnu has put its print on all of the worlds, and that foot is within the heart of holy people, and so the heart of holy people is the largest of all, the greatest of all. The devotees were delighted with Ishan's words. Ishan intended to retire to a solitary place and practice a special discipline of the Gayatri, through which Brahman is invoked. But the master said that the knowledge of Brahman was not possible without the complete destruction of worldliness. Further, he said that it was impossible for a man totally to withdraw his mind from the objects of the senses in the Kali Yuga, the present age, when his life was dependent on food, annagata pran in the original. That is why the master discouraged people from attempting the Vedic worship of Brahman and asked them to worship Shakti, the Divine Mother, who is identical with Brahman. So again, this was a summary of the conversation that M made here. Usually M puts out the whole conversation, but here he, for whatever reason, summarized it in this narration. But Ishan wanted to devote himself to practicing the Gayatri and invoking Brahman through the Gayatri. We meditate on the effulgent glory of that luminous being who has projected the worlds, the three worlds. May that illuminate our hearts. And so through this, who's going to do a special discipline with that. There are various practices associated with the Gayatri Mantra. And one of my teachers said that all of his spirituality, which was considerable, is a man of great illumination. He said that all of his spirituality had come through the power of the Gayatri Mantra. He had a regular Ishta Mantra too, which he repeated, but it was the Gayatri Mantra which was his main practice in his early years of practice, which led to the awakening of spirituality in him. So Ishan wanted to do that, a very noble thing. But Sri Ramakrishna here is telling him that the attainment of Brahman through that direct path is very difficult. And so it's better to worship Shakti. He says here in the narration, or M reports Sri Ramakrishna as having said, that in the Kali Yuga, this present age, which is considered a degenerate age, as all cultures have considered the last several thousand years the degenerate age. It was the same with the Greeks and Romans, which they called it the Iron Age. As Sri Ramakrishna used to say, that in this degenerate age, people are annagata pran, which means that their life force depends on food. He said in olden times, in ancient times, the rishis could perform extraordinary austerities and could fast for long periods of time while they kept their mind single-pointedly fixed in Brahman. He said modern people, they are dependent on food. That is, they have to eat regularly, stay healthy in order to practice spiritual disciplines. If they give up and try too much austerity, the body can't withstand it because we've become used to luxury and are used to comfort at least. And so he says that in this age, it's best to worship Shakti, that is, the power which has caused the infinite transcendent Brahman to manifest as this universe. Master to Ishan, why do you waste your time simply repeating neti, neti, not this, not this? Nothing whatsoever can be specified about Brahman except that it exists. So Sri Ramakrishna is agreeing with the teaching of Neti Neti, that Brahman is not this, whatever you can think of, whatever you can imagine, whatever you can visualize, that is not Brahman. Brahman is that which transcends all of this. And so nothing can be said of Brahman except that it is. That's all that can be said of Brahman. So he agrees with that. It's just saying that once you know that, then why go on saying neti neti? And then he continues, whatever we see or think about is the manifestation of the primordial energy, the primal consciousness. So everything here that we perceive, everything that we think about, is a manifestation of the primordial consciousness, the primordial Shakti, the manifesting power of consciousness. Creation, preservation, and destruction, living beings and the universe, and further, meditation and meditator, bhakti and prema, all these are manifestations of the glory of that power. So everything that we experience is a manifestation of the glory of Shakti. So Sri Ramakrishna was bringing Ishan's mind to that perception. Instead of thinking neti neti, Brahman is not this, and trying to hold the mind to that abstraction, which is a traditional practice, and which can still be done by those who have that temperament. But Sri Ramakrishna saw obviously that for Ishan, the way of the recognition of Shakti, and for the vast majority of people, the recognition of Shakti, that all of this is the play of the divine, that is the much easier path. Because in one path, the neti neti, we have to negate everything. We have to negate the very ground on which we're standing. We have to negate the very mind which is saying neti neti. Everything has to be negated. Everything has to be thrown away. Everything has to be pushed aside. And only that which we don't perceive at all now, only that is left. And everything that we know, everything that's familiar, everything we think about ourselves, everything we think about the world, all of that has to be negated. Whereas with the worship of Shakti, it's not neti neti, but iti iti. That is, this, that's seeing everything as a manifestation of consciousness and worshiping everything as a manifestation of consciousness. So, but Brahman is identical with its power, Brahman and Shakti. On returning from Ceylon, Hanuman praised Rama, saying, O Ram, you are the supreme Brahman, and Sita is your Shakti. You and she are identical. Brahman and Shakti are like the snake and its wriggling action. Thinking of the snake, one must think of its wriggling motion as well. And thinking of its wriggling motion, one must think of the snake. Or they are like milk and its whiteness. Thinking of milk, one has to think of its color, that is whiteness. And thinking of the whiteness of milk, one has to think of milk itself. Or they are like water and its wetness. Thinking of water, one has to think of its wetness. And thinking of the wetness of water, one has to think of water. So you may think that, well, you can't separate milk and its whiteness. Well, that's the very point. You may think that, well, you can't separate water and its wetness. Well, that's Sri Ramakrishna's point, that you can't separate Brahman and its Shakti. The two are the same thing. It's by an act of mental abstraction that we can think of water and we can think of wetness separately as an abstraction. In reality, we can't separate the two. As an abstraction, we can think of the whiteness of milk as a color. We can separate out the idea of color and the idea of milk, which we drink, which comes from a cow. But you can't actually separate the color of milk from the milk itself. The two are the same reality. It's only by mental abstraction. And so this universe of Shakti and the Brahman, which is the primordial consciousness, that they are the same reality. With water in its wetness, milk in its whiteness, fire in its power to burn, that we know in our everyday experience and see that they are one. It's only a mental abstraction that separates the two. We're in a very different situation here with the perception of the universe and the idea of Brahman, which we don't perceive. So Brahman right now to us is an abstraction because we don't perceive it. We read about it, we think about it, but it's an abstraction. And so that we can see quite clearly separate from this universe. But that's because it's an abstraction. For someone like Sri Ramakrishna, who had realized Brahman, and realized Brahman in its depths, he saw that Brahman and its Shakti are the same. They can't be separated. So to us, that seems different from water in its wetness or fire in its power to burn, but that's only because we only at present experience the one and have no idea but a rough abstraction of the other. This primal power, Mahamaya, has covered Brahman. As soon as the covering is withdrawn, one realizes, I am what I was before. I am thou, thou art I. So this is, again, these simple statements in a text like the Gospel, the same with the conversations of Holy Mother and Swami Vivekananda, the simple statements that we think we understand, but they contain profound meaning. This primal power, Mahamaya, has covered Brahman. Why is it that we don't see Brahman? It's because we see the manifestations of Shakti and not Brahman, because there are the two powers of Shakti. I'll use the Sanskrit terms, but just to say them, but I'll explain it in English. The Avarana Shakti and Vikshepa Shakti. Avarana Shakti means the veiling power of Maya. That is, first I have to not see Brahman in order to misread what I'm seeing. First, the nature of Brahman has to be veiled before I can see something else. So the Avarana Shakti, the covering Shakti, the veiling power of Shakti of Maya is first. First, I have to be unaware of Brahman, and then I can project a different view. I can see a world instead of Brahman. So the world is the projection of the Vikshepa Shakti, the projecting power of Maya. And so these two powers go together, the veiling and then the projecting. And so this primal power, Mahamaya, has covered Brahman. Yes, the example is given in the Vedanta texts that if in the twilight I see a stump and it's not dark enough for me to see the stump clearly, I just see a form in the twilight. Then if I'm expecting to meet somebody in this neighborhood, then maybe I think that it's that person I'm supposed to meet. Or if I'm suspicious, maybe I think, well, maybe that's a thief or somebody. I better run and protect myself. First, there has to be the hiding of the stump. If I could see the stump clearly, I wouldn't think that it's my friend or that it's a thief or it's somebody else. I would see, oh, that's a stump. So first it has to be obscured by the twilight. And then I can project the view of something else. Oh, I think that's my friend standing over there. So with this, if there weren't the veiling power obscuring the nature of Brahman from us, making us forget the reality of Brahman, then we would just see everything as Brahman. We would see nothing but Brahman. There would be nothing but Brahman. There wouldn't even be us to see something. There would just be Brahman. But first there's the obscuring power and then the projecting power. Then instead of seeing Brahman, we see a world. And so whatever we see or think about is the manifestation of this primal power, Mahamaya, has covered Brahman. As soon as the covering is withdrawn, one realizes, I am what I was before. So yes, that's said to be one of the characteristics of illumination. When one attains to realization of one's identity with Brahman, part of the experience is recognition. And so in Kashmir Shaivism, they call realization pratyabhijna, recognition. One realizes, oh, this is what I always was. So one doesn't think that, oh, I realized something new. One realizes, oh, this is what I always was. Even in my delusion, this is what I was. Why didn't I see it? It's so obvious, so obvious. Why did I not see it? And so that's the strange situation that we are in, where we're not seeing the obvious, that which to an illumined soul is the most obvious thing in the world, and yet we don't see it. And so again, on the attainment of illumination, we're not creating something new. We haven't become something new. We realize, oh, this was the truth all of the time. It's so obvious. Why didn't I see it? It was right there, and somehow I didn't see it. I am what I was before. I am thou, and thou art I. That experience of identity with Brahman. As long as that covering remains, the Vedantic formula, I am he, that is, man is the Supreme Brahman, does not rightly apply. The wave is part of the water, but the water is not part of the wave. As long as that covering remains, one should call on God as mother. Addressing God, the devotee should say, you are the mother and I am your child. You are the master and I am your servant. It is good to have the attitude of the servant towards the master. From this relationship of master and servant spring up other attitudes, the attitude of serene love for God, that is Shanta Bhava, the attitude of friend toward friend, Sakha Bhava, and so forth. When the master loves his servant, he may say to him, come, sit by my side. There is no difference between you and me. But if the servant comes forward of his own will to sit by the master, will not the master be angry? And so here the idea is that, as Sri Ramakrishna often said, that when one thinks one is a body and mind, one is the karta, the doer, the agent of actions, one has karma, one does good things and bad things and so forth, then to say that I am he is a misapplication, because I'm thinking I am this person that I think that I am. And I am he, no, this person is not that. I am he means that I'm not Swami Atmarupananda. I have nothing to do with this body. I have nothing to do with this mind. I have nothing to do with the personal history of this. I am the infinite, wrongly thinking that I am this person. And so if I don't have that awareness and go about saying I am he, I'm thinking that I, this person, am he. No. And so then Sri Ramakrishna said, it's better to take up the attitude of a child of the mother. Mother, you are the whole and I am the part. You are the ocean and I am a wave on the ocean. And as the song says, the wave belongs to the ocean, never the ocean to the wave. And so as a wave, I belong to you. But one comes to this, I am thou, thou art I, which he said before. And so he says that if the attitude of a servant also is good. First he says the attitude of a child to its mother, and then he says the attitude of a servant to the master also is good. And so in the Hindu tradition, Hanuman is presented as the ideal servant of God. And so in Hanuman, you don't see any servility. That is, any meanness, any lowness, none of that. Hanuman is the heroic servant of Ram. And so that's the type of servant attitude that is wanted, not this type, but the heroic servant, like Hanuman. And so he says that when the master, God, is pleased with the servant, then the master may say to the servant, come, sit by my side. What I am, you are too. We're the same. And so through that attitude also comes the realization of our identity with God. God's play on earth as an incarnation is the manifestation of the Chit Shakti, the divine power. That which is Brahman is also Ram, Krishna, and Shiva. And so God's play on earth as an incarnation is a manifestation of the glory of Chit Shakti. Chit means consciousness, and Shakti means the power of consciousness. And so in the path of Advaita Vedanta, non-dualistic Vedanta, the emphasis is on Chit, consciousness, just absolute consciousness, striving to get a sense of what consciousness in itself is, not as conscious mental processes, but just consciousness as the light of awareness itself, without any process, without any object whatsoever, just the light of awareness. So one seeks the transcendent Chit consciousness. But Sri Ramakrishna is talking about Chit Shakti, the power of consciousness, that is, the power which causes the manifestation of this universe. Everything here is a manifestation of Chit Shakti, the power of consciousness. This and everything that we think is matter, everything that we think is mental or material or emotional, whatever, all is just a vibration, a movement in the ocean of Chit Shakti, the power of consciousness. So, so God's play on earth as the incarnation is a manifestation of that Chit Shakti. That which is Brahman is also Rama, Krishna, Shiva, etc. Ishan. Yes, sir, both Hari and Hara are derived from the same root. The difference lies only in the pratyaya. So again, he brings up that same thing he had said before. Master, yes, there is only one without a second. The Vedas speak of it as Om Satchidananda Brahman, the Puranas as Om Satchidananda Krishna, and the Tantra as Om Satchidananda Shiva. So Sri Ramakrishna in his typical way is saying that all of these are the same reality. Whether you're thinking in terms of the transcendent Brahman, or whether you're thinking in terms of Krishna or in terms of Shiva, it's all the Om Satchidananda Brahman, Shiva, Krishna, the same reality. The Chit Shakti as Mahamaya has deluded all with ignorance. It is said in the Adhmar Ramayana that when the rishis saw Rama, they prayed to him in these words only, O Ram, please do not delude us with your world-bewitching Maya. And so Sri Ramakrishna here, speaking of how it is Chit Shakti, the power of Maya, which has left us in delusion. So again, the problem with all dualistic explanations of the truth, they're much easier for people to understand. And so Sri Ramakrishna explains things in those terms oftentimes, as even do people like Shankaracharya. They explain from the standpoint of dualism because it's easy to understand, because it's put in terms of our own experience. But one of the problems you see in a statement like this, that Chit Shakti as Mahamaya has deluded all with ignorance. And so then God becomes the source of delusion. And indeed, the texts like Chandi and so forth say that. And that's the part of the meaning of the image of Kali. The Kali is the giver of life, the giver of death, the giver of goodness, the giver of suffering, etc., the giver of everything. But again, the problem with that when we're still in a dualistic frame of mind is, how do I worship a God who has caused my own delusion and my own suffering? How can I worship such a God? So Sri Ramakrishna gives the answer in what we've already read earlier in the Gospel, long back. He says that when he's talking about, oh no, that comes later. I'm sorry, I was thinking about something else we already read. But later he will say, when he's talking about everything being the play of Mother Kali, one of the devotees says to him, but sir, it may be the play of Mother Kali, but it's our suffering. And Sri Ramakrishna says, yes, but who are you? Meaning the idea here is not that Mahamaya is out there causing delusion for us, a separate being out there who causes delusion for us, which means causing suffering, bondage, lifetime after lifetime of misery and all of that. Who's going to worship such a God? As Swami Vivekananda says, my whole life should be a fight against such a God. But the idea is that Mahamaya is not out there. Mahamaya is here. The Divine Mother is here. Shiva is here. Krishna is here. And so these things have to be understood from the inside out, not from the outside towards us. Yes, that's a common way of explaining it because that's the common way of understanding. But eventually we get to the problem, well, why did God create my bondage? Why did God create all of this misery? So it's better, and that's why Swami Vivekananda from the beginning started from the standpoint of non-dualism, because he realized that in modern times, with modern education and with the more critically trained minds, people will begin to ask that kind of question. And so the old answers no longer suffice. The old mythological answers no longer suffice. So then Sri Ramakrishna speaks of the Adhyatma Ramayana. As most of you know, there are many different Ramayanas. There's the original Adi Ramayana of Valmiki, which is a source book for all of the later Ramayanas, but there are many other Ramayanas. There are Ramayanas in Sanskrit, other Ramayanas in Sanskrit, and Ramayanas in every regional language, at least every literate that is written regional language of India. And so the Adhyatma Ramayana is one of those, which takes the story of Sri Ram and Sita in an more allegorical sense and finds non-dualistic meaning behind the story of Rama. So here it says in the Adhyatma Ramayana that when the rishis saw Rama, they prayed to him to remove that he not delude them with world bewitching Maya. So Sri Ramakrishna doesn't develop this any further because then next Ishan asks a question which diverts the discussion. But perhaps, at least this is consistent with what Sri Ramakrishna said on other occasions about the rishis in the Ramayana, perhaps he would have said that the rishis were only interested in realizing Brahman, and so they prayed to Rama just to protect them from the power of Maya, so that they could realize the absolute. But they didn't ask him for supreme love, supreme devotion, etc., because they were practitioners of the Shanta Bhava. That is the attitude of trying to realize the reality as ultimate peace, stillness, quietness, tranquility, and not through the attitudes of loving God. So Ishan then asks, what is this Maya? Master, whatever you think or hear, whatever you see, think, or hear is Maya. In a word, woman and gold is the covering of Maya. So here that's a little not immediately obvious, the connection. To his hearers, certainly it would have been, because Sri Ramakrishna had the power to convey the meaning of what he was saying through his words. That is, his words were living words of power. But when we read them in a text, without the presence of Sri Ramakrishna and the force of his words coming from his own mind and the atmosphere of his own mind present in the room, sometimes there's a break in the obvious logic that we don't see. So whatever you think, see, or hear is Maya. So all of this is Maya. And then he says, in a word, woman and gold is the covering of Maya. Well, what's the connection between woman and gold and everything that you think, see, or hear? The connection there is not obvious, but the connection is that it's the attachment to lust and to greed that is what holds us to Maya. And so, yes, because we are held within Maya, everything we perceive, we hear, see, and think all of these things. We come into this universe of perception, and all that we perceive is a manifestation of that Brahman. But what is it that is the root cause of all of that? And that is our attachment. And so by getting rid of that attachment, then this also goes away. Then we realize the truth. We see Brahman everywhere. We see everything as Brahman. So there is no harm in chewing betel leaf, eating fish, smoking, or rubbing the body with oil. What will one achieve by renouncing only these things? The one thing needful is the renunciation of woman and gold. That renunciation is the real and supreme renunciation. Householders should go into solitude now and then to practice spiritual discipline in order to cultivate devotion to God. They should renounce mentally, but the sannyasi should renounce both mentally and physically. So there's no harm in chewing betel leaf, that is pan, eating fish, smoking, or rubbing the body with oil. So these are all things, examples of things that one, when they renounce the world, typically in India, they give up. But Sri Ramakrishna is saying that these are minor things. In fact, he told the boy Gangadhar, who later became Swami Akhandananda, Gangadhar was extremely austere. In his boyhood itself, he was extremely austere. And so Sri Ramakrishna, seeing that he was emphasizing physical austerity too much, he said, look at Narendra. He chews pan, betel leaf, all day. He's chewing pan. And yet his mind is always absorbed in God. Meaning that these physical practices don't overdo them. There's no need to overdo them. So here, this chewing betel leaf, eating fish, smoking tobacco, rubbing the body with oil, those are not big deals. The essence of spiritual life is fixing the mind in God. So what will one achieve by renouncing only these things? The one thing needful is the renunciation of woman and gold. And again, of course, meaning lust and greed. And then he says that householders should go into solitude now and then to practice spiritual discipline. And that he says many times. That it's very beneficial for householders to go into solitude once in a while. Why? Because we are all creatures of habit. We even see this universe. This universe is nothing but habit. We see this universe because it's become a habit to see the universe. And so everything that we do is habit. All of our attachments are habits. We are attached to things. Why? Because we have the habit of depending on them. And so everything in life is habit. And so if you're living in the midst of the objects which support your habit, then it's very difficult to change. By going now and then into solitude for even just a day or two or three, going into solitude and praying intensely to God, reading holy books, praying intensely, then it's much easier to look at the habits that you have objectively and see what you can do to improve the habits of your life so that you begin to form new habits and it's easier to extricate the mind. But living in the midst of all of your normal supports, it's difficult to do that. So the householders should renounce mentally, but the sannyasi should renounce both mentally and physically. So here we will stop for today and continue next time with his words about Keshav Chandra Sen. So I'll stop here. And let me give announcements, and if there are any questions, I will take those. So for announcements, on Sunday, the topic is a part of the series on basic concepts of Vedanta. And so the basic concept we'll take up on Sunday is meditation, dhyana. And so that will be the topic for Sunday. Then Tuesday, we'll continue with the Katha Upanishad. And so we're just beginning, we've just finished in the Katha Upanishad, the first chapter out of 6 chapters. The first chapter which tells the story of Nachiketa going to Yama. And so on Tuesday, we'll begin the teachings of Yama, where he agrees to teach Nachiketa the nature of the self, what comes after death. And then on the next Thursday, we'll continue this class at 11 o'clock. Then on the following Sunday, the 13th, a week from this coming Sunday, so a week and a half from now, we have an open house at the new retreat, Lone Star over Trinity Retreat in Trinity, Texas. That's, again, Sunday the 13th. We'll begin at 12 o'clock. And we'll have a 2-hour program, roughly 2 hours. It's going to be an informal program, so it's not tightly structured. But it will include an explanation of what our plans for the property are, a guided meditation, because it's going to be a meditation retreat, and so we want to initiate it with some meditation and people's good thoughts. A picnic lunch and a tour of the property. We'll show you around the property. Of course, the whole property is 91 acres, and so we won't take you through 91 acres, but you can see as much as you have the energy to wander over. And then the nearby parts, we will, all of you can see, and we'll show you around the house that we're working on and the land itself. So that's the 13th, 12 o'clock. We sent out an email which has a link for Eventbrite, where we ask the people who want to come that they register, so we have some sort of head count of how many people will come, so that we can handle logistics. Let me also mention that those of you who have a lawn chair that want to bring a lawn chair, you can bring that. We'll take some of our folding chairs from here. But those are of limited comfort, as you know. And so if you have a folding lawn chair, one of those that has the nylon bands or something, aluminum frame that's easy to fold up and to carry, there are many types available nowadays. You can bring those also. And we will provide a picnic lunch. And very important, there is no functioning bathroom yet. I've been spending last night and this morning looking at bathroom possibilities for what we can put in there, but that won't happen by next Sunday. So there is no functioning bathroom on the property right now. So we ask that people stop before they reach the property. In Trinity itself, there's several convenience stores where you can stop. And during the program, if you need to excuse yourself just 5 minutes away, there are convenience stores with restrooms. So we apologize for that inconvenience, but we wanted to start having something there and have people come and see the property. So now for questions. Why is the birth of a child considered impure? That's a very good question. And I wondered that myself. I didn't make the rules. These are traditional rules and something that I never had to deal with because that never came into my experience. But I know from reading that is considered a time of impurity. And I think it's just because of the physicality of the childbirth. And so it's not that the child is impure. It's just the physical nature of all that's involved in giving birth. And so these things are traditional ideas. We don't teach these things in foreign countries because they pertain to, and they're part of the civilization of ancient India and the culture of ancient India. And so we don't, when we go outside of India, we don't teach these things. And even within India, our order doesn't emphasize these things. But these were traditional ideas. And so the only answer I can give you is that it's because of the physicality of the giving birth process. And so death is an obvious thing, that with the death of a person, we enter into mourning. And so our minds are in a sad state. And whatever the state of our mind, that influences everything that we do. And so in that state of sadness and mourning, then that is the reason why it's considered an impurity. Because the mind is tainted by the sadness and the idea of death and the idea of loss and everything. So, what is the significance of Sritakur's teachers? Why were they sent to him? Yes, they were sent to him because even the incarnation has some degree of Maya over the mind, which needs to be removed. That's why Sri Ramakrishna went through his spiritual practices. To some degree, the incarnation knows from the beginning who they are and why they have come. but it's only a partial understanding. So we see that in the lives of the incarnations. We don't see it so much in the life of Sri Krishna, but that's because the life of Sri Krishna has been so idealized. We don't have records of Sri Krishna's childhood except for the stories told in texts like the Srimad Bhagavatam and the Vishnu Purana, which came long after Sri Krishna lived, and by which time his life had been so idealized that from his birth itself, he knew that he was Mahavishnu and acted the part. But we see that with the incarnations, those who are somewhat more historical, that is, where the historical record is more complete, we see that there was a process of their awakening to their full potential. So something was there to begin with from their birth itself, but the full understanding was not. And so he had to go through these practices. And so then there's the added significance in Sri Ramakrishna's life that that he one of the purposes of his life was to show the harmony of all religions, that all religions are basically true. And so he took teachers of different disciplines, a succession of teachers, in order to realize God through these different methods, and thereby show, though this wasn't something he set out to do, but it was something apparently the Divine Mother set out to do. He set out just to, with a love for God, sought God, experienced God as the Divine Mother, and then he thought, well, how do these people worship God? How do these people worship God? How do these people worship God? And experienced more and more. And so that was part of the special meaning in Sri Ramakrishna's life. But Sri Krishna is mentioned in the Upanishads. I think it's the Chandogya Upanishad who mentions Sri Krishna, not yet as an avatara, because in the time of the Upanishads, they didn't have the concept of the avatara. That had not been developed yet. But Sri Krishna is mentioned as being the disciple of who I forget. But Sri Krishna is mentioned as the disciple of so-and-so. And so there you see that even Sri Krishna had a guru. Regarding the projecting power, why do most of us see the same things when we look out into the world of Maya? Yes, that's a good question. There are a couple of different explanations. One is very abstract and highly philosophical. I won't go into that. I'll give the one that is the usual explanation and the most acceptable and most understandable explanation. And that is that this universe exists in the mind of Brahma. So Brahma, the creator, not Brahman. Brahman has no mind. Brahman is beyond time and space and thought, just pure awareness and bliss. But Brahma, the creator, Chaturmukhi Brahma, Brahma with four heads, the deity, minor deity, imagines this universe into being. So this universe is projected in the mind of Brahma. And then we take birth within this world, which is projected by the mind of Brahma. And Brahma projects not just this world, but all the worlds are projected from the mind of Brahma, the heavens and hells, all the way up to Brahma Loka and this world. And so we find ourselves in this world, which is the dream of Brahma, and we are dreaming our own dreams within this world. And so each of us sees the world differently. That's why some people say, oh, the world is so beautiful. And some people say, oh, I hate this world. Some people say, oh, I just love people. I love to be around people. I just love people. And the other people say, I hate it, people. Everybody's a cheat. Everybody's a liar. Everybody wants to get my money and so forth. So we all see a somewhat different world. Yes, we agree that this is a book, this is a glass, this is a table, and so forth. But we see those things also differently. And so we see a commonality, but we see it from our own distinct perspective, different from everybody else. So we are projecting our own dream within the dream, the larger dream and more stable dream of Brahma. Can you please elaborate on the wave is in water, but water is not in the wave? No, it's not that water is not in the wave. The idea is that the wave belongs to the water, but the wave belongs to the ocean. The ocean doesn't belong. The water of the ocean doesn't belong to the wave. So the wave is nothing but water. It's just a form of water. But when you look at the wave, you're not looking at the whole ocean. The wave is just the wave depends completely on the existence of water for its being. Water doesn't depend on the wave for its being. And so the wave is completely dependent. So that's the idea. It's just in the way that it's expressed right here that creates the confusion. But it's really a question of what depends on what. And so I, as a wave of in the ocean of the Divine Mother, I depend on the ocean of the Divine Mother for my existence. She doesn't depend for her existence on me. Just as the wave depends on the ocean for its existence, the water of the ocean doesn't depend on the wave. I'm not clear on why the attitudes of friendship, etc., spring from the attitude of servant, as the master says. Yes, and that's not obvious at first. So it's not that one has to begin with the attitude of master and servant, but Sri Ramakrishna is saying that also, first he said the child to the mother, and then he says the servant to the master is a good attitude. So he means it is also a good attitude, and it does lead to these others, because look at the example of Hanuman. Hanuman was a servant to Ram, but he was also a friend of Rama. And he could even counsel Rama sometimes, as a servant sometimes counsels the king. We know from Indian history that the barber was the person who heard all of the knew all of the king's secrets. And the barber oftentimes would even offer counsel to kings. And so the servant, the heroic servant, not the servile servant who's afraid of the shadow of the king and afraid of being beaten and runs away when he sees the master coming, not that kind of servant. But the heroic servant like Hanuman also has a friendship with Rama. And Rama even looks after the welfare of his servant. And so sometimes the master becomes the servant of the servant. And then the servant also, like Hanuman, loves and worships the master. So it's not an attitude of being servile. So it said that in these different attitudes, in each one of the attitudes contains something of the other attitudes. So, okay, so that's the end of the questions, and greetings to all of you who have sent your greetings. And so I'll give a closing chant, and before that, wish you all a good weekend, and hope to see you on Sunday, and also the following Sunday at our new retreat. Om Niranjanam Nityam Anantarupam Bhaktanukampa Dhrita Vigraham Vai Ishavataram Parameshamidyam Dam Ramakrishnam Shirasa Namama. We bow in adoration to Sri Ramakrishna, who is stainless, eternal, infinite, the worshipful Supreme Lord, who took human birth out of compassion for all. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Om peace, peace, peace be unto us and to all the beings of the universe.